Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Managing Your Vendor's Performance, Why It Matters, and How to Do It webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content Widget, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss vendor performance management, basics, SLA and KPI development, creating scorecards, and more. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our 3 ways to measure vendor performance infographic, understanding vendor performance metrics and scorecards ebook and template, 8 vendor service level agreement best practices infographic, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
All right, well, welcome everyone to today's session on vendor performance management. We are going to jump right in, talking about why vendor management is important, what the 4 components of vendor performance management are. We're going to learn all about metrics, the different types of metrics and how we use them. And we're going to break them out by SLAs, KPIs, and the role they play in performance management. We'll also get into performance scorecards, reviews, and managing issues. And then we're going to wrap up with some key takeaways today. So let's get started. So what is vendor performance management? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's managing the performance of the vendor. But to get a little more granular, it is first a routine process that ensures all your vendors are delivering what it is that we expect them to. And this being a routine means we do this all the time. It entails verifying that the products and services are delivered on time with the right quality and at the right price point. And the key word here is verifying, as we confirm, not assume this is actually happening. And then vendor performance management also helps your organization ensure that that vendor relationship is helping your organization achieve its strategic goals. So vendor performance management is really important for many reasons, but here are the top 3. First of all, we always need to watch the performance because declining performance is usually an indicator of risk in other areas, and we want to make sure that we catch that early before anything big goes off the rails. The second is that we need to confirm that the vendor is fulfilling the terms of the contract and delivering the value of the relationship. And finally, it really enhances our vendor comparison data so we can look at 2 vendors and have more criteria as to determine which one might get more opportunities, for example. So right off the bat, we want to establish who is responsible for this process. And first and foremost, the vendor owner is responsible. Now, the vendor owner is the individual that vendor is assigned to, that has the day-to-day relationship with the vendor and is responsible for completing all the vendor risk management activities throughout the lifetime of that relationship. That means that they're managing issues, that they're managing performance, and they're holding the vendor accountable. So as I say, the buck stops here for vendor performance management. But the third party or vendor risk management team is there to oversee that process and make sure that everything is documented. They need to track the issues, and they need to hold the vendor owners accountable. And then finally, senior management is responsible for making sure that the policy is enforced and that vendor owners and third-party risk management are both doing their jobs. All right, let's talk about the 4 components of vendor performance management really quickly. The first important one is that we have established and agreed upon SLAs and KPIs. The next one is that we have good performance data collection and reporting, because we need to have a way to substantiate the performance. We need to measure it. So what are we measuring it against? We also need to make sure that we have performance review meetings where we periodically sit down with the vendor and really talk about their holistic performance over a specific time period. And then finally, issue management with time-bound tracking and closure. That means that when there are performance issues, that we report them, we track them until they are fully remediated. All right, so before we even think about how to structure and manage those vendor performance metrics, we need to understand what our own objectives are. And, you know, we can consider that every organization has organizational goals, right? Here are just a few examples. So maybe your company wants to increase revenue or break into new customer segments or increase a net promoter score. What we need to think about in terms of our vendors is how they're going to help us accomplish those goals. Now, of course, no one vendor is going to help us meet all our goals, but we should be able to articulate how a specific vendor is going to contribute to or support your organization in meeting their goals. And that understanding and articulation are really the foundation of excellent vendor performance management. So right from the beginning, we always want to think about how our organization's objectives are going to translate to our vendors. And from there, we'll want to be able to distill those objectives into performance metrics for those vendors. So the 3 questions we need to ask ourselves every time are, how will this vendor help us meet our goals? What specific actions or service levels will help us meet our goals? And how are we going to measure success? Now, I know this is a lot to think about, so let's jump into a working example. Okay, so we've been told that examples can be very helpful in these webinars, so today we're going to work with this example throughout the presentation. And in our example, we have a fictitious company, So Nice General Store, or SGS for short. And this is a retailer that sells apparel, accessories, and some household goods like towels and bed linens. Now, SGS has a bit of a cult following because they were known for selling organic cotton goods that are manufactured in the United States. And they were also known for their charming stores and their excellent customer service. But then the pandemic happened. And just like many other retailers, they had to close their brick and mortar stores and move to a fully online model for the first time. But hey, surprisingly, this little pivot turned out really well for the company and sales increased dramatically. But their business changed quite a bit too. So for example, for the first time, they were really able to track repeat business and customer loyalty. And the number of items sold in a single transaction went way up. But with that change, they were also getting a lot more returns than ever before, and the number of customer service inquiries skyrocketed. And so they can't handle this on their own, so they decided to outsource their customer service to the Right Answer company, which provides inbound call center services. All right, so let's start at the top with the big picture. We want to look at some of these goals that SGS has for customer acquisition and retention. Now we can read through this list of goals and you can see that not all of them are necessarily going to be appropriate for our right answer call center. But some of them are going to be appropriate. Specifically, we want right answer to help us improve our customer satisfaction scores. We want to reach an NPS above 60, and we want to increase the exchange rate versus the return rate. Now, those are all great objectives to cascade down to the vendor. You know, some of these, like an online review average of 3.5 stars or higher, that's really not going to work. So you really need to think about what is appropriate for the vendor and how you're going to cascade that. Now, while you think about that, think about one of your vendors. Specifically, which organizational goals or objectives are they helping you meet, and how would that be translated into their performance? And while you're thinking about that, Jesse, I think it's time for our first poll.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, we have a standardized process to track and report vendor performance. Yes, partially, no, or unsure. And Hillary, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
Let's do it.
All right. And that question is, does every contract need SLAs?
No. Not every contract is going to be appropriate for SLAs. You really want to think about SLAs for your more critical, high risk, and more complex products and services. You know, a lot of times we might have contracts, for example, that come from a big company like Google or Amazon Web Services, and they have their SLAs sort of already baked in. There's not a lot we can do to negotiate them, and that's okay. We should still track them. But on, say, a contract for a moderate vendor, you may not want to put those SLAs in there. It might be that the product and service is not that complex. It's a pretty straightforward, either they did it or they didn't, which should be enough, you know, in and of itself. But I do recommend really putting those SLAs into your critical and high-risk contracts all the time. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also, before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our Understanding Vendor Performance Metrics in Scorecards ebook and scorecard template. This comprehensive resource can be helpful in explaining vendor performance metrics. With that, Hillary, back to you.
Now, when it comes to vendor performance monitoring and management, there's all sorts of things that are involved, and that could be all of your metrics, your scorecards, your dashboards, and it's really important to learn how to design and implement these tools effectively. You know, knowing which objectives we're going to include and knowing if a metric is subjective or objective can really make all the difference in effective performance management. It's also really good to know when and how you should use a service level agreement versus, say, a key performance indicator. And keep in mind that how you and your organization manage vendor performance is completely up to your organization. You get to determine the metrics, the data capture, the reporting, the issue management, and the organization of that information. And while some of the concepts I'm sharing today may not work for you, and that's okay, but there are endless opinions and methods for performance management. What I'm going to do today is share some really tried and true methods that have proved to be pretty effective during my third-party risk management career. Now, we're going to start with one of the most important components of vendor performance management, and that is your performance metrics. And metrics are a form of measurement, and we generally use them in a scorecard or dashboard to get more information about the vendor's performance. So let's jump in and get really familiar with the different types of these metrics, what purpose they serve, and how best to use them. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that metrics come in two flavors. They're either objective or subjective. And I'm going to get into more detail about each type in just a minute, but it's important to understand that both types of metrics are valid and both can be used when evaluating vendor performance. However, we should always ensure that objective or quantitative metrics account for most of our performance management. And let's learn more about them to understand why that is the case. Objective metrics are known as quantitative, which has the root word of quantity, meaning something that can be counted or measured. Examples are quantities, volumes, capacity, time, etc. And when it comes to measuring performance, objective or quantitative measurements should account for most of your metrics. Why? Well, because you can get a consistent and comparable metric that allows you to see performance over time or within a specific context. So this is like our apples to apples measurements. So let's use a quick example for our call center. We know that customers expect customer service agents to pick up the phone and resolve that issue quickly. So we might look at the average answer time, the length of the call, and if the issue was resolved. Those are all fact-based metrics, that we can measure. But what if we expect the agent that is picking up the phone to be friendly and kind? Okay, that is a very different expectation. How do we measure that, and who defines what friendly and kind are? That is an example of a subjective metric. Now, subjective metrics are just that. They're subjective. And they're accounting for something that's observed, experienced, or felt, which can be a lot more difficult to measure and can be extremely variable depending on the perspective of those doing the measurement. So back to our call center example. A customer from Charlotte, North Carolina might have a different idea of what constitutes friendly and kind than, say, someone from Boston, Massachusetts. Now, I can tell you that because I've lived in both of these cities, and there are some pretty big social and cultural differences between these two places. And each of these customers might have a different assessment on whether or not the agent was actually friendly and kind based on their personal expectations, their experiences, and their social norms. So should we really measure that? Well, let's think about it. It's not to say that being friendly and kind is not an important attribute for a customer service agent. It absolutely is. But if we haven't done the work or taken the time to define what constitutes friendly and kind and how to specifically measure that, we aren't really being fair to the vendor. So I bring this up because you can see this a lot in customer service. You could just measure your call center by how your customers feel. But if you're running a call center, and maybe it's a collections call center, for example, some of your customers may not feel that great to begin with. So whenever you can, make sure your subjective metrics are supported and balanced by objective metrics. Now let's talk about service level agreements, key performance indicators, and key risk indicators. All right, let's start with service level agreements. You know, some people use SLA and KPI interchangeably, and they are not the same. SLAs are documented performance agreements, and they represent the must-have for the engagement. You can think of SLAs as the deal breakers or non-negotiable expectations. A good rule of thumb is that service level agreements are developed with the vendor during the contract negotiation, and that KPIs and KRIs substantiate whether or not the SLA is being met. It's also recommended that the term service level agreement is reserved really for those agreements that are in the contract, not for every metric. Now, because service level agreements are the most crucial expectations we have, there's usually an agreed upon penalty if they're not met. So in many cases, that will be a rebate or a discount or other financial remedy, but there might be other treatments as well as determined by your organization and the vendor. It's also important to note that service level agreements should be developed with the vendor during the negotiation, the initial contract, and we use KPIs and KRIs as metrics that substantiate whether that SLA was met or not. It's also recommended that we just use the term service level agreement for those requirements that are in the contract, not for every performance metric. Now, what are some things we might put SLAs around? Here are some examples. We might have response time or accuracy, safety, customer satisfaction, and breach notifications. Again, SLAs are contracted levels of service or performance that represent those must-haves in the relationship. But it's also important to note that not all SLAs have punitive consequences. So for some specific services, SLAs can be used to incent above average performance. You might see this a lot in call centers or collection centers. So in this example, for every month the call center averages above 90% customer satisfaction, they will get a 10% bonus on their bill. So we know that the best SLAs are always created in collaboration with the vendor. Both parties have to agree, because if you just go out and create unachievable or unrealistic SLAs, the vendor's either not going to agree to it or agree to it and fail. All right, so good SLAs are developed and negotiated by both parties, and that usually requires some give and take on both sides. But what should be in the actual agreement? Well, first of all, the agreement should define the overall objectives. What is the organization expecting to get through using this particular vendor? They should also explain the roles and responsibilities of both the vendor and your organization. So, for example, maybe your vendor's ability to deliver a product or service depends on an output from your organization. So suppose you have a logistics vendor that is dependent on your sales report to do capacity planning for their trucks. You would need to state that in the SLA. You want to state the compensation for failing to meet the SLA and any awards for exceptional service. So how specifically would the vendor compensate you for missing the SLA, and what's the expected time frame? And don't forget, if you're going to use it for incentives, to include that in the SLA as well. Remember, you don't have to offer an incentive for exceptional performance for every vendor, but if you do need to spell out the details. You need to define what constitutes a critical failure, because even if your vendor has had to issue credits for failing to meet the SLA, repeatedly missing that SLA could be grounds for terminating the contract. We need to identify the specific performance metrics, both KPIs and KRIs, if you're going to use them, that support and substantiate the SLA. Remember, keep these to the absolute minimum necessary, because you're memorializing them in the contract. And it's not going to be so easy to change them without amending or renegotiating the contract. You can certainly establish and track and monitor other KPIs without them being part of the SLA. And make sure you spell out the specific KPI or KRI, the data source that's going to be used, and the frequency of review and reporting. Let's explore those KPIs and KRIs a little bit more. So here we have an example for Right Answer Call Center. This is the SLA agreement that's going to be specific to customer satisfaction. We've listed 4 KPIs that are foundational to reaching customer satisfaction. So we want 70% of the calls to be resolved at a minimum. Of course, we want all the calls to be resolved, but that isn't really possible. But we'd like to see more than 70% of the calls resolved. But that 70% is the lowest we can go without missing the SLA. And we want the calls resolved in 5 minutes or less. So 80% of the calls must be resolved within 5 minutes. We also have a customer satisfaction score from the post-call survey, and we need that average to be at least 3.5 or higher, and that's on a scale of 1 to 5. We want the calls to be picked up within 180 seconds, and that means that customers do not hold for more than 3 minutes before they actually get to talk to an agent. Yep, we want that to happen faster, but 180 seconds is the minimum acceptable wait time before they miss the SLA. We've also identified some 2 key risk indicators here, because we know that when people hang up before the call is answered, it's going to affect our ability to help them and drive customer satisfaction. So if the call abandon rate goes above 20% for any reason, there has to be a specific action plan to get it back in the acceptable range. We also have another risk indicator here, and that's for security audit findings. The vendor needs to make sure that all physical and data security rules are being followed at all times. So if there's any finding during a security audit, they miss the SLA, because poor security practices pose a big risk to our organization and its customers. So getting into KPIs, or key performance indicators, these are the metrics that are used to measure progress towards meeting that goal or to indicate trends. And when it comes to your vendor performance management, you can use KPIs independently, or you can use them to substantiate specific service level agreements. It's important to remember that you don't have to have a massive amount of KPIs, and you don't have to measure every single aspect of your vendor's performance. You want to measure the things that are most meaningful. And just because you can measure something doesn't mean you should, because KPIs can and do change. They can be refined over time or replaced. It's really up to you and your organization to figure out which KPIs are best, but you want to focus on the KPIs that will help you measure how well the specific goals or objectives are being met. Remember that KPIs are always going to tell us about something that has already happened. So they're what's called a lagging indicator, but they're still very useful, and they help us identify trends in performance. So let's look at some attributes for effective KPIs. Remember, the KPIs you choose is totally up to you and your organization, but there are some good rules to follow. So the first one is to structure those KPIs so they do have a connection back to your organizational goals and objectives, and they measure the factors most important to reaching those objectives. KPIs should be validated through reliable, accurate, and timely data, so we need to make sure we identify the data sources that we're going to use to validate those KPIs. So who's providing the reporting, at what intervals, what is the data source? We want to use a SMART formula, so we want specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Now, I'm going to stop here to say that achievable and realistic are super important, because no product or service is ever going to be perfect. So when we say that everything should be 100% all of the time, that's pretty much setting everyone up for failure. That is not to say that you need to have low standards. Absolutely not. You just need to be realistic about it. We want to track our KPIs over time to help us spot trends and show patterns. A good example might be a call center that works really well from January to, say, October, but right around November, it always seems to take a dive. That information can help us determine that we need more personnel in December, for example. Most importantly, effective KPIs are always created in tandem with the vendor, and this is essential because they're the ones that must achieve the performance. I think most of us can probably relate to a situation where our manager, we identify and discuss our KPIs versus just having them given to us. You know which situation is preferred and which one works better. So work in tandem with your vendors. Now we have another type of metric called a key risk indicator, or a KRI. And these are metrics that help you predict potential risks that could harm your business or your customers. We also think about KRIs as being a leading indicator, meaning they can tell us about something that hasn't happened yet. That's why they're so useful. And they can be a control because they help us identify those potential issues before they turn into great big problems. Again, we need to validate them through reliable, available, accurate, and timely data. They need to use that SMART formula, and we can use them to look at trends or show patterns over time. And again, they need to be created in partnership with the vendor. Now, Key risk indicators are those that are basically going to set off the red flags, because when a KRI is beyond the accepted tolerance level, that is our sign to take action. All right, just to give a few more examples outside of our customer service call center, here are a list of potential KPIs or even KRI categories and examples that you might use for your vendor performance monitoring. So take a look at these and see if you can spot which ones are subjective. You know, most of these are going to fall into that objective category where we can definitively measure or count something to get those results. You know, we have some marketing ones like customer online engagement, IT, you know, number of information security incidents, operations, defect rates, customer, maybe customer retentions or call center agent training. The variety is endless, but while you think about which ones you might want to use, it's time for another poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization require contractual SLAs for critical or high-risk vendors? Yes, all critical or high-risk vendors. Partially for some vendors depending on the product or service. No or unsure. Hillary, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer.
Okay.
And that question is, how do you handle vendor performance when you don't get to negotiate the contract, such as when you have terms of service agreement?
Well, just kind of similar to our last question, you know, we do have those vendors that sort of give us the conditions of the service. We don't have the ability to negotiate. We can't change the contract. It's either take it or leave it. And in those situations, there really is not a whole lot you can do. So what you need to do, however, is review those agreements very carefully. You need to itemize the SLAs that they claim they're going to meet, and you need to track them. So if you have an uptime SLA, for example, which is a very common one, you would need to understand what the SLA is about, how often do they promise uptime, how you would track it, so do you have the data necessary to say whether they have 95 versus 98% uptime. And then if there's any remedy that's offered through that service agreement, such as a rebate or a discount, you would definitely want to follow up with the vendor to make sure you get that. But it is true, sometimes we just have those agreements that we can't do anything about, and the best thing we can do is hold them accountable for what they're promising to us. I hope that helps.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget, where you will find our 8 vendor service level agreement best practices infographic. This resource provides SLA best practices to be aware of. Okay, Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
Now, I want to talk about data and reporting for just a minute, because these two elements are really the foundation of any performance evaluation. Now, in a lot of cases, your vendor is going to be providing the data to substantiate their performance, and that's totally fine. However, when you're reliant on a data source that's not yours, you need to occasionally test that data to make sure it's accurate. Now, I've personally experienced this one. Their performance data said one thing, but internal operational data said something very different. And it turned out that an equation had the decimal in the wrong place, and the variance over time went really crazy. So we had to get in and pull everything apart. But if our team had just thought about that testing before there was a giant error, that situation would not have occurred. So test your data occasionally to make sure everything adds up and that you are measuring the right factors. Now, one thing that's true in life is that timing is everything, and it's especially relevant when we're thinking about how often to pull and review our vendor performance data. A good rule of thumb is built around the service cycle or transaction length. So in this example, suppose our call center gets about 500 calls a week, and each one of those calls is going to contribute to the vendor's performance and probably your NPS rating. Now, in each one of those calls, they present the opportunity for something to go good or bad, and in some cases very bad. In this situation, we would want to look at that data more frequently because if we don't spot trouble early, there are a lot of opportunities to go wrong. In this case, approximately 3,000 opportunities a month. So what if 1 in 3 calls was below your quality requirements? You could spot that the first week and immediately start remediating the performance, or you could wait a month and find out that now you have 1,000 unhappy customers. And maybe you only look at quarterly and find that you have 3,000 unhappy customers. That isn't the best plan. So really consider that service cycle or transaction frequency when you're deciding how often to review the data supporting performance. Now let's jump in and look at some sample dashboards and scorecards. So here we have a very jazzy dashboard from our call center, and it's capturing most of our core KPIs, and it's breaking out some of the data in more detail. So we can see, for example, how each agent is performing. Now this example is just for 1 week, and we might use that dashboard to manage and monitor vendor performance more frequently, because this is our call center. We have to look at it more frequently. And while this particular dashboard is really cool, it does have some limitations. For example, if I submit just this dashboard as evidence of vendor performance monitoring to, say, a regulatory examiner, it is missing some important information. And while there's nothing about this particular dashboard that's bad, it's just presenting a limited data set that could potentially raise more questions than it answers. For starters, we don't have targets on here for all the KPIs, and we really don't know what happened because a KPI or a KRI was missed. And I bring this all up because there are lots of software packages and data visualization programs that can help you create really awesome dashboards. And they can be really great for helping us manage and monitor our vendor performance. But the truth is that most dashboards are going to focus on specific aspects or time durations of performance, and they're not going to give you the full picture. So that is why we need to think about a full scorecard or a report card for your vendor and vendor performance review. So let's look at another example. Now here's another example of a dashboard, and this one is not so visually appealing, but that's okay because while we may want everything to look really slick and polished, it's really the information that you're presenting that counts. I want to emphasize this because not everyone has the resources to create really fancy dashboards with gauges and charts, and it's not a requirement. It's about the data. But what I do like about this one is it has the targets listed, and there's more information such as the data source. What I do like about this one is it has those KPIs and KRIs right next to each other. And in this one, they have a KRI for every KPI, which is definitely something you can do if that makes sense. But even though this dashboard has more information, it still has limitations. Again, dashboards can be really great tools for that constant monitoring and to look for visual representations of performance. However, dashboards themselves are not the same as a full vendor scorecard. So let's talk about what should be in your scorecard versus a dashboard. All right, I want to talk about vendor scorecards for a moment. And if you have existing scorecards or are already a pro, a lot of this information is going to still apply. But I'm really trying to speak to those of you that are new to vendor scorecards or are implementing scorecards for the very first time. Now, there are just as many ways to assemble a scorecard as there are vendors. And there are countless templates and services and software offerings out there. But we're just going to start with a very basic and simple way to put together a scorecard. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. The first of which is that a good scorecard has that essential data on a single page. And you can, of course, present supporting data with that scorecard, but don't expect most folks to look at more than your first page. Now, why is that? Because let's say you're providing the scorecard, the quarterly scorecard for every critical vendor for your monthly board reporting package. You know, a lot of organizations might have anywhere from 15 to 30 to 40 to 50 critical vendors. So what you include has to be concise, easy to read, and to the point. We also want the scorecard to really just highlight the most relevant performance data. Now, on that scorecard, we should have the targets, whether any service level agreements have been missed, the specific key performance indicators we're using. Any other metrics like KRIs should be on there. Open issues, remediation plans, emerging risks or issues, vendor commentary, and a summary statement. So let's look at that in practice. All right, let's talk about scorecards versus dashboards for just a minute. Your dashboards are very helpful in doing short interim performance management. And typically, they're going to focus on a limited set of KPIs or a limited time frame. Whereas your scorecard is going to be a more holistic, comprehensive view of vendor performance for a specific time period, right? And we use it during the vendor performance review. Now, this is a very basic scorecard, and I promise you I'm keeping it that way on purpose because I don't want anyone to believe they can't have an effective scorecard without a bunch of bells and whistles. And so we've kept it very simple for this reason. This is not a template. We just mock this up in Excel. So again, do not feel like you need some big fancy thing to have an effective scorecard. Now, in the scorecard, the main sections, if we start at the upper left, we see that we're reviewing the whole fourth quarter here. We see the vendor name, and we see that general performance target or that objective because we want to use that as our North Star because we need to make sure that the vendor's performance is helping us meet that goal. We also have a section saying were all the SLAs met? If not, which ones were not? We have an aggregate score for the KPIs for the whole time period. And we've used that traffic light or red, amber, green color coding so we can see exactly where the trouble spots are. And the KRIs are listed in the same way for the same reason. Now on the scorecard, I included a section for stakeholder comments because that can be very valuable when you have a diverse group of stakeholders that are potentially impacted by the product or service. You know, we need to take them into consideration. We also have the list of open issues and resolution plans on the scorecard. We have a section for the vendor to comment. Now, you may not always see this on a scorecard, but this can be really important for two reasons. One, we want to give the vendor a chance to explain the performance or comment on any issues. When we give the vendor that opportunity, it really demonstrates that we're actively collaborating and reviewing the performance together. And number two, it serves as a default acknowledgement that the information presented is correct. Now, why does that matter? Well, if we look at this vendor and how they've been performing, really isn't that great. You know, there's a lot of shortcomings here. And what if our organization is getting ready to pull the trigger and terminate the contract? This scorecard with the vendor's comments can serve as important legal evidence should that vendor decide to push back or try and pursue litigation for improper termination of the contract. You know, another important section that you don't always see, but I'd love to include, is that summary from the vendor owner or that relationship manager regarding the performance, any next steps, etc. You can see by looking at this all together that this very short but comprehensive scorecard can be reviewed by anyone, be it your management, the board, auditors, and they can get a good picture of how the vendor performed and how your organization managed that performance. Now, just how often do we have to have this formal vendor performance review? For critical and high-risk vendors, this process should occur at least quarterly. For your moderate risk, you can do this 1 or 2 times a year, depending on the product or service and what your organization feels comfortable with. For low risk, you know, the truth is we're probably not going to be doing a lot in terms of performance management for them because they're low risk for a reason. And one of those reasons is that if we need to replace them, it's fairly easy. So they don't perform, we just get another vendor. Okay, so having the vendor performance meeting does take a little bit of planning on your part. So you definitely need to do some prep work up front and get the information to the vendor prior to the meeting so they can prepare their response, do their root cause analysis or whatnot, and provide any updates. When you actually have the meeting, you want to go through all of the information. You want to review any issues or remediation plans. You know, take notes. I'm going to say it a billion times. And you want to store the scorecard with the vendor record, right? And we want to retain all of that evidence. We want to retain the meeting invites, who attended, those notes, the scorecards, any remediation plans for vendor presentations. You want to keep that all in case you have an audit or exam later. So in our vendor scorecard example, there were some performance issues that were missed. And when it comes to an SLA, you always have to determine if the penalties are going to be applied and document when you should expect that remedy. And that should always be documented and retained as part of the vendor record. Also, your scorecard should have a very high-level description of remediation plans, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a detailed and documented agreement between your organization and the vendor. And again, retain that in your records. So make sure you include the summary of the issue, the duration and the impacts, the root cause, what caused the issue, what the plan of action is for fixing it, and when we're going to fix it by. So even your best vendors can run up against troubles. They can have some performance issues. And, you know, we just can't pull the plug the minute there's one performance issue. But over time, we might start wondering if it's really the best thing to keep that vendor. I like to say that it's almost always worth it to try and fix the issues versus just running out to replace, just because there's a lot of effort, time, and money getting a new vendor on board. So here's some things to look out for. You should definitely consider working on the problem with the vendor when they're responsive, they're responsible, that they're proactively bringing things to your attention, they're giving you updates, and they act with a sense of urgency, right? That's really important here, and that they demonstrate they value you as a client. On the other hand, if they're not taking responsibility, they don't tell you about any issues, they wait until there's a problem to argue whether the KPIs are the right ones, and they just generally want to pass the buck, they don't really value your business, and that may be someone you should consider exiting. Now, what you think about that? It's our last poll of the day. Jessie.
Our next poll question is, does your organization track and monitor vendor performance issues as part of your vendor issue management process? Yes, for critical vendors only. Yes, for all critical and high-risk vendors. Partially, some issues are tracked depending on product and service type. No, or you're not sure. Hillary, we can go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
Okay.
What if a vendor disagrees with your performance management review?
Well, I'm not going to say that doesn't happen, because it absolutely does. And before we get to what if they don't agree, I think one of the first things we need to, reiterate here is that we have to set those expectations at the beginning of the relationship. We have to define the KPIs at the beginning of the relationship, the SLAs, the KRIs, and we have to agree on the data that's going to substantiate those metrics. So if we've done that and the data speaks and they've missed the metric, there really shouldn't be too much of an argument. It's when we get into expectations that are not clear or documented, or that have somehow changed since you had your original agreement. So my first recommendation is always go back to your contract, always go back to what is in writing, because that's what is enforceable. And then if for some reason they're still feeling challenged by it, I think that depending on the situation, you might have a couple different paths you could take, but certainly document the conversation, document the issues, and whatever decisions you make regarding the final outcome. Most vendors are not going to push back if it's in writing and they know the expectations up front. I hope that helps.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. Also, I'd like to mention that you'll find our 3 ways to measure vendor performance infographic available for download in the related content widget. This resource explains why measuring vendor performance is an important activity that helps protect your organization. Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, just to wrap up our presentation today, some key takeaways. Again, make sure you know how your vendor is going to support your organizational goals. Use those SLAs to document and enforce the most important non-negotiable requirements. Balance objective and subjective metrics. Track your KPIs over time to identify trends. Test your data. Consider that service cycle or transaction length when you're trying to figure out how frequently you should monitor the performance data. Always, always, always track and document and report vendor performance issues. Require remediation plans. It's nice to talk through it with your vendor, but get it in writing. And finally, keep your scorecard simple. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jessie.
Great, thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On March 23rd, our Beyond the Basics, Strategies to Mature Your Vendor Risk Management Program. And on March 30th, our Vendor Financial Red Flags Your Credit Union Should Watch For. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, should vendor performance management fit within the third-party risk management program or be managed by procurement? Also, where have you seen this fit within other organizations, or are there instances where both third-party risk management and procurement has vendor relationships and or performance management coexist?
Well, it definitely sounds like the question here is about how do we organize all of this? And the truth is that every single organization, your company, my company, we all have to decide where these responsibilities fit. Now, technically, and sort of the best practices, we have a vendor owner who has a day-to-day relationship with the vendor. A lot of times they're also the person who's responsible for that product or service at the organization, and they are responsible for that performance management. Remember, third-party risk management, they own the framework and they are providing oversight and making sure everything is happening. And procurement, a lot of times, they're about identifying those vendors, negotiating contracts, getting discount, purchase when you buy a lot of volume. So it really does depend on your organization, but ultimately, whoever the vendor owner is, they're responsible for performance management. And what that means at your organization may be a little bit different, but technically that's where it should be. Hope that helps.
Great. Next question. How do you establish metrics in an organization that has an established vendor base but has never had metric tracking?
This is really common, so it's a great question. I went through a similar exercise, many years ago where we just said, hey, not all of our vendors have any performance management. So we actually went through kind of a big change management process. First was about letting the vendor owners know and giving them some guidelines about how to identify those metrics. And, that took a couple months. And then official notifications to the vendors. You will get vendors who will push back and say, not in the contract, I'm not responsible. But mostly folks will want to work with you as long as it's not too egregious. The next thing is even if you do have pushback and those KPIs and those SLAs are not in the contract, they need to be teed up to either be in an amended contract immediately or at the next contract renew cycle. So, you're going to just jump right in the middle of it, and you have to start somewhere, but begin with communicating to your vendor owners and formally communicating to the vendors that it's coming.
Next question. Can you have KPIs that are not part of the contract or statement of work? If yes, how do you support holding the vendor accountable to something they did not agree to formally?
You know, there's different ways to do this. Obviously, we like to put anything that they're being held accountable to, especially if there's a penalty, in some sort of legal agreement, right? So you may not have a specific service level agreement, but you may say, here's our 5 KPIs, and we expect you to meet them. Now, you can have none of that, but you could still use like industry standards, right? If somebody is doing something that would be considered completely outside best practices and sort of norms for the industry, that's one way you can point to it as like, hey, you know, you guys are doing this and nobody else would do that. So my best advice always is, if you are brand new to the relationship, set those expectations up front. If you jump into an existing relationship, start setting those expectations, start having those discussions with the vendor so that you can get things in writing, because we do want them to agree to it so that we're not just pushing uphill, okay?
Great. Next question. What do you recommend we do if we currently don't have an SLA with a high-risk vendor?
Well, similar to what we were just talking about, I think if the SLA is necessary for the product or service, start opening that discussion, look for industry norms, have, check out how amenable the vendor is to amending the contract, because that's really going to be your best way to get that going.
Great. Next question. What are the differences between a KPI and KRI, and do you have an example?
Yeah, so basically your KPIs are your key performance indicators. In that way, we're looking at, hey, this is performance that's already happened, right, because we're backward looking. And we could use our call center example. So if we said that in our KPI, we want all the calls, or 70% of the calls need to be resolved, right? That could be our KPI. Now, conversely, we could use that same sort of metric, but as a KRI, where we say anytime that we are below 75% of calls being resolved, we know we need to take action because we're going downhill. We're hitting that threshold. So the thing that is interesting is that KPIs can be used sort of in reverse for KRIs, but generally what a KRI will do is it will set a threshold, sort of like a warning level against that KPI target. So yep, they're not at the bottom yet, but they're getting there. So that's when our bells go off and we need to address the performance. I hope that made sense.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question, and this goes right along with the last question. Can one person's KPI be another's KRI?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just how your organization wants to use that information. And, again, a lot of KRIs are more characteristic because they have thresholds. Like they'll say, it should be between this and this. This is acceptable. Below this level, it's not acceptable, and we need to take action. Or above this level, whatever your threshold is. Where KPIs tend to be a single target, like sort of the minimal viable performance, right? The lowest acceptable is generally the KPI, where KRIs tend to have ranges a little bit more. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank and online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, such as vendor performance. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.